Hello students, this is Dr. Bijendra Jha, and today we will discuss a new topic, that is political ideology. This topic fall in PSIR paper PSIR paper 1 section A, and here you need to study one unit, that is political ideology. And in this section we need to discuss several political ideology. One of the dominant political ideology is liberalism, and which is your first political ideology developed in 17th century. And the another political ideology is socialism, that actually countered liberal ideas. And then if you look at the feminism is another political ideology that came and developed in the mid of 19th century and thereafter. And if you look at the fascism, this is a political ideology that developed in Europe, particularly in Germany and Italy in 20th century. Now, if you look at Gandhism, Gandhism becomes a political ideology that evolved during the India's freedom struggle. It is about Gandhi idea. So let me talk about first the term, what is ideologies basically. Let me talk about what is the term meaning ideology. For example, if you look at ideology, now it has two words. One is idea and second is logic. Logic. Now this has come from the word logos, that means knowledge, right? The science of idea. Now every subject, if you put logy like sociology, it means science of society. Biology, the science of bio. Similarly, you see that political ideology, it means science of political ideas, right? And there are political ideas like rights, liberty, justice. These all are political idea. Now, if you look at political ideology, political ideology is a perspective through which you can see the world. In today's world, we are surrounded by several political ideology, and one of them is liberalism. Now, in today's world, individuals are described as liberals or socialist or Marxist or feminist or fascist. What this term mean? And we need to understand this political ideology to understand the world. Now let me move to the first ideology which developed in the 17th century and that continued in development and its progress in 18th, 19th and 20th century. Now look at political ideology that we are concerned with, that is liberalism. And liberalism, as I told you, that evolved in 17th century, right? And it remained one of the dominant political ideology in 18th, 19th, 20th century, and still it is relevant in the 21st century, right? There are liberals, but at the same time, there are critique to liberals. Now look at, who was the father of liberalism. If you see the John Locke writing, right? John Locke is known as father of liberalism. Apart from John Locke, there are many philosophers who contributed for development of liberalism. For example, Adam Smith. For example, if you look at J.S. Mill. For example, if you look at Ernest Barker, right? So there are many philosophers who contributed to this political ideology. Now, if you look at, this is a meta ideology. Meta ideology means it is a big ideology. There are several variants of liberalism. For example, classical liberalism, modern liberalism, neoliberalism, ultra-liberalism. So there are several versions of liberalism. Now, if you look at, This idea, this ideology developed in 17th century to counter, to challenge the authoritarian regime, right? The despotic rule of the state. Now, if you look at the medieval era, the king used to legitimize their authority over their subject. But there are several movements. If you look at, there are several movements. Now, for example, look at the Renaissance. The Renaissance actually talked about revival of religion. It centered on man. It did not center on society or state. It centered on man. And if you look at Renaissance, Reformation, right, Enlightenment movement, these all movements contributed for the evolution of liberalism. And this ideology focused on certain themes. For example, it focused on self-autonomy of individual, the freedom of individual. It talked about the rationality of man. For liberals, all men are rational. They are the best judge of their own work. And therefore, they should be free. Man should be free. There should be no external interference in the activity of man, right? And man should be allowed to live their own life, right? So they focus on rational man, right? And they're focused on individualism, not on society. So if you see that, evolution of liberalism, it evolved against the despotic rule of the monarch, of the state, as well as against feudalism. Because if you look at feudalism, this was an idea very prominent in the 14th, 15th, 16th, and 17th century. And if you look at feudalism, focused on, restrictions, right? And what was the source of restrictions? Of course, religion. Religion. The society was basically hierarchical, right? There was a hierarchy in the society. And at the top of that hierarchy, monarch was the, legitimate authority. They asserted divine right theory. For example, James II of Britain and Louis XIV of France, they asserted that we are representative of God. I am the representative of God, right? And therefore, I have a full authority over our subject. Now look at the people have reacted. And there are many philosophers like Thomas Hobbes had given social contract theory. John Locke, they had also given social contract theory. And these two philosophers rejected the divine right theory. And consequently, if you look at this idea developed, that is called liberalism. Now, if you look at the initial phase of liberalism, right, it focused on some certain things. Now, what was that certain things, certain features? Now, if you look at certain classical liberalism, they argue that man is a rational agent. Man is a rational agent. Man is not subordinate to others, right? And all have rationality, reason. Therefore, they should be free, and there should be no external control and constraint on individuals' freedom, right? Now look at the second core value that I'm talking about, that is liberty. Liberty is the core value of liberalism. If you see John Locke, he said that all individuals are equal and free. All are rational. The liberty of each one of us in the society are equal. It is a reciprocal, right? Consider there is in the society there is a 5 person, A, B, C, D, right? A has same amount of liberty as B has, and B has same amount of liberty as E has. So everyone has equal freedom, and there is no external constraint. So if you look at the early definition of liberty, evolved as that absence of constraint, absence of external interference. Of course, the man should act according to their rationality, and our liberty should not intervene in the similar liberty of others. Otherwise, it will turn into a license. There is a difference between liberty and license. License means uncontrolled freedom. Locke said uncontrolled freedom should not be allowed. Liberty is fine, but uncontrolled freedom is not allowed. Why? Because we all are equal, right? So therefore, this freedom should be exercised on the basis of our rationality. Our freedom should not harm the others' similar liberty, right? So if you look at liberty is the core idea of liberalism. Now, if you look at the next salient features, that is called individualism. According to Locke, it is individual which came first, and then society evolved later on. Then state came up. So individual is prior. Individual is prior. Why? Because they came first. And then several individuals gathered together and they formed society, right? And later on, they did social contract, and then there's a state came. So individual is prior to the society, to the state. The state should not impose some restrictions which is not reasonable. The society should not impose restrictions which is not reasonable. And therefore, right, individual is a supreme. Each individual is self-master. Each individual is a self-master, self-autonomous. Self-autonomous. They are not under the authority of anyone, right? Except, of course, rule of law, that, you know, or the government, that we people frame it, we people make it, right? The state evolved after a social contract. It is not a product of the God, right? So look at, they focused on individualism. Now, next, if you look at the next point here, I would like to talk, it was 3. Now, if you look at next point, they talk about equality. Liberals argue that we all are equal, irrespective of differences we have on the basis of class, on the basis of ethnicity, on the basis of region. We all are equal. So liberals talked about 3 types of equality. The first equality, they talked about equality before the law. Equality before law. It means in the eye of law, we all are equal. There's no privileges, right? If you look at the medieval era, there was a privileges like king, right? Or the lord, landed class. Or in India, look at the rajas, look at the mansabdar. They had privileges. And look at the, you know, the majority of the people, they were subject. So there was a hierarchy in the society. And liberals opposed this hierarchy and they supported equality. Now, so if you look at equality before what? Equality of before law, right? Look at Britain, where rule of law evolved. And rule of law talked about absence of arbitrary force, right? Law should govern, not the arbitrary force. Now, second equality, it talks about principle of non-discrimination. Principle of non-discrimination. Now, what do you mean by principle of non-discrimination? The state should not discriminate anyone on the basis of race, caste, religion, ethnicity, language, and so. All are citizens for a state. So look at even the idea of citizenship evolved during evolution of liberalism. We all are equal and we all have equal civil and political rights, right? So no one can be discriminated. This was the second core ideas in equality. Now look at the third one, that is equal opportunity. Equal opportunity. Now liberals talks about that we all have equal chance. It means, of course, it is related to the second version. The state cannot discriminate. The state cannot be biased. The state cannot be partial. The state must be impartial. The state must be, give equal opportunity to everyone, right? So look at the equality. They all talked about equality. Now let me move to the next slide. And if you see that the other, they also talk about state. They talk about the state. And for liberals, a state should be limited state. What do you mean by limited state? Limited state means it should not possess arbitrary force. जो मन हुआ वो आप नहीं कर सकते, right? आप स्टेट को कैसा होना होगा? लिमिटेड स्टेट होना होगा, right? A state will rule through the rule of law. The state shall govern through rule of law, right? And a state should be limited, right? Now look at it. Talked about limited state. Let me give you the idea of limited state. They talked about that a state should be like a night watchman, right? A state should be like a night watchman. Now what night watchman does? ये night watchman करता क्या है? ये कुछ नहीं करता है जब तक कि कोई भी गड़बड़ी ना शुरू हो जाए. ये देखता रहता है. जब सब कुछ ठीक चल रहा है तो ये इंटरवेंशन नहीं करता है, बट अगर कुछ गड़बड़ होता है तो फिर ये एक्टिव हो जाता है. Look at another example, right? Like referee of the football game. It allow maximum freedom to every players to play up to the extent they can, right? And they intervened only when someone, do some mistake, try to fall, and then it enters. So a state should be limited state, a night watchman state, right? A state should not intervene. Now look at another example. Now this is actually John Locke who's talking about, right? Now look at Adam Smith. Adam Smith says that a state should be a laissez-faire state. A laissez-faire state means the state should intervene minimum whenever it is necessary. Otherwise, it allow every individual in their economic and political affairs to free. They exercise freedom, and it would be good for individual. And if each individual would do good for themselves, ultimately society will do good to themselves. So they talked about limited state. Now look at the another features of liberalism. They also talked about rights. Liberals are very concerned about rights. For example, look at the John Locke, and he said, certain rights are inalienable, not separable from individual. For example, You know, Locke talks about a right to life, liberty, and property. And property, right? That every individual has. And a state needs to protect these rights of individual. A state needs to protect these rights of individual, and it should not intervene. So they actually talked about rights, and for them, every individual is a right bearer citizen or people or agent. So every individual has certain inalienable rights, right? Now, so they talked about, they were very clear about rights, that every individual possesses certain rights. And what the minimum certain rights that every individual possesses, that is right to life, right to liberty, and right to property. Right. Now, look at the another features of liberalism. Right. Now, look at they value tolerance. For liberalism, a state should be a tolerant state. A society should be tolerant society. An individual should be a tolerant individual. Right? We should allow plurality. We should allow every individual to exercise their religious freedom, their cultural freedom as they want. So basically, they were very, in favor of tolerance. I'm talking about liberals, yes. Now look at another salient features of liberalism. They talked about constitutionalism. Constitutionalism, right? Now, what is constitutionalism? It is the belief that a government should be based on the constitution, a written document which prescribes law, power, authority, structure, functions to each organs of the government. And the emphasis was to limit the state authority. Because if you look at the medieval era, the state authority was actually despotic, absolute. So constitutionalism talked about, limited state. Again here, limited state, right? Their purpose was to limit the state and at the same time, allow civil and political rights. Civil and political rights to everyone. सबके पास civil and political rights होगा. Now, what do you mean by civil right? Civil right means, a right to life is a civil right. Right? Now, right to work is a civil right. Right to property is a civil right. Right to religion is a civil right. Right to speech and expression is a civil right. Right to possess property is a civil right. Right to marry is a civil right. So there are, several civil rights, and that evolved with idea of liberalism. We know that in feudalism, the earlier age, we all were not equal. But today we are talking about equality. Today we are talking about a government which is based on the constitution. So constitutionalism focused on civil and political rights. What is political rights? Exactly, right to vote. Right to vote. Right to be elected. Right to be elected. Right to representation. Right to representation. Right? For example, certain community demands representation. Look at the example, for example, Indian Women Association or movement. They actually talked about a right to representation for women. If you look at Indian Parliament or State Assembly in India, women are less represented, abysmally low, right? And now if you look at the last year, the government passed Nari Shakti Vandan Adhiniyam, which reserved 33% reservation for women in the parliament as well as in the state assembly. So political rights means right to vote, right to be elected, right to representation, right? And this is actually the, based on a constitution. Everything is based on the constitution, right? So constitution limits the state, right? And constitution will give the rights to every individual about their life, about their political matter, right? So constitutionalism was also one of the features of liberalism. Now let me move to the next. And if you look at, they also talked about a government. Now, if you look at liberals, what type of government a liberals want, right? A liberal want. If you look at, they talked about democratic and representative government, of course. The democratic government, right? And one of the kind of democratic government is representative government. Representative government, right? बंद कर दिया क्या? अच्छा, तो क्या करना है? तो पॉज कर दीजिए फिर. कितना मिनट हुआ? This representative government shall take all decisions on the behalf of the people, right? So on the behalf of the people. So therefore, if you look at the power and authority lies in the hand of the people. So people is a source of authority and power, right? So it talks about popular sovereignty. Now, if you look at the constitution of every country, and most of the country talks about the authority on the behalf of the people. So liberals actually talks about democratic government, representative government, right? It talks about representative of each and every community. It talks about the right to vote of each and every person, right? So they talked about representative government. Now, if you look at this liberalism further evolved, right? Not what the further evolution, uh, is all about. Now, if you look at liberalism, evolved in 17th century, right? And after 17th century, there was a modern liberalism. Modern liberalism evolved in the mid of 19th century, right? That I'll discuss in the next class. For the while, if you like the class, we are going to begin our batch at Shankar IAS Academy New Delhi branch for the PSIR from July 15th. You can come and join with me. Thank you so much. See you.